propaganda still alive today has convinced most Americans that these bombs saved lives. I think maybe the only bombs in the world that ever saved lives. Well, preparing for that kind of mass destruction, planning it, getting ready and being willing to initiate it is so hard to fathom for most of us. And for the people who actually do it, it's hard for them to reconcile with a clear conscience. You can imagine working directly with them requires a sort of psychic numbing, or optimistic myth-making, you might say. This is why nuclear weapons are believed to have the power to and influence that really is not real. They're thought to be imbued with this ethical value and a practical purpose even, that allows the weapons workers like this gentleman from Boeing to continue preparing for deliberate, indiscriminate destruction that is actually uncontrollable, unthinkable, and unlawful. This myth-making was on full display when the Grand Force Air Force Base had a ceremony saying sayonara to the last missile in Grand Forks. There were 2 sets of missiles in North Dakota, one in the east, one in the west. All the ones in the eastern part of the state were removed. And at this ceremony, Colonel Roush here laid out the standing rationale. For 34 years, ICBM stood as a deterrent to any adversary in the world that might consider challenging the peace and freedom that we enjoy. Well, this deterrence claim is like common knowledge in the school system and the culture at large, but it ignores and denies hundreds of attacks on our wartime peace and freedom. To name a few, the 1970 hijacking of the Eastern Airlines flight, the 1979 Iran hostage crisis, the 1983 Marine barracks bombardment in Beirut, the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, some of you will recall, the USS Cole having been bombed in 2000, of course the official version of the 9/11 attack, the Boston Marathon bombing, and a couple dozen other smaller terror attacks that could not and could never have been deterred by land-based missiles. Were they attacks on our peace and freedom? I think so. Another principal myth of the nuclear age was repeated by Colonel Roush in his ceremony saying goodbye to the Grand Force missiles. He said, quote, "Because of the ever-present missiles on alert, we won the Cold War." Of course, this is common knowledge in the United States, too. But no one did win the Cold War, and there were thousands of losers, even fatalities in our own country. In 1995, it was estimated that $4 trillion had been spent since the end of World War II on nuclear weapons alone. Money that might have been better spent saving lives. It did produce with that money 27,000 warheads, nuclear warheads operational. Now we have 7,000. So was that a waste of money? Some other people who might argue with this claim of having won the Cold War are the over 33,000 U.S. workers who died from radiation exposure at their nuclear bomb plant job site. This was a one-year-long investigation by McClatchy newspapers, the 3rd largest paper in the country, just published last December. Of course, this is a low estimate of the number of actual fatalities in nuclear weapons plants. Some of this information was made public during the Carter administration, when federal legislation was finally established allowing some of these survivors of the dead to get compensation if you can prove that your relative died from their worksite exposure. It's very hard, in fact, to establish that. Another group that might take issue with this claim of having won are the 16,000 U.S. citizens who were treated as laboratory animals without their consent in human radiation experiments conducted in this country by universities and research institutes all over the country. Pregnant women in mental institutions, orphans in orphanages, prison inmates, totally without their knowledge, injected with plutonium in some cases. These kids in this orphanage were given plutonium in their breakfast cereal. These were divulged under Secretary of Energy Hazel O'Leary. I have a hard time getting through this human radiation experiment section. But Hazel O'Leary was Clinton's first female Secretary of Energy, and she made this public. Now, there's an excellent book on the subject called The Plutonium Files, if you want to verify and study more deeply into this phenomenon of this scandal. She said the first thing that occurred to her when she found these files was the Nazis, the prison camps. And in fact, after the Nuremberg trials, there were established federal laws that prevent and forbid the use of experimentation on patients without their consent. And so that's why Hazel O'Leary exposed these experiments and tried to bring some compensation to survivors as well. Another group, again, this is a government study, National Cancer Institute and the National Institutes of Health studied just the iodine that was part of the fallout of the atmospheric bomb tests conducted by the United States at the Nevada test site. Lots of isotopes were dispersed by those tests. Helen Caldecott reports that 5 metric tons of plutonium was dispersed to the atmosphere by atmospheric bomb tests between China, Russia, France, the U.S., and England. But just the iodine was studied in this case, iodine dispersed by 100 tests, and the National Cancer Institute found 75,000 thyroid cases will have been caused in this country by our own bombs, and some 15% of them might be fatal cases of cancer. This is all online studies from 1997 as well, if you want to read further. Well, about the, back to the book per se, after the maps were published, as I said, it helped engender a lot of protest against these missiles. Here's on the right Sam Day, the original mastermind of Nukewatch, who came up with a lot of great ideas of how to bring public attention to our nuclear arsenal. We had this very banner with us yesterday out at N1, one of the missiles in Colorado, for an annual vigil against that particular site. So that banner's got a lot of use over the years. Another reason for reissuing the book is illustrated in this photograph. There's now a National Historic Site. The grand opening was September 24th. Near Rapid City, South Dakota, the Minuteman Missile National Historic Site. And the entire museum cost about $4 million. It's a beautiful new facility. The $4 million was saved by not having to demolish that missile. The 150 that used to be in South Dakota are now all gone, except they retain one launch control center, which is this photo, and one missile for tourists to visit. And so the $4 million that was saved was donated to the Park Service by the Air Force to build this museum, which pretends and teaches us that the nuclear weapons system is a thing of the past. This is going on all over the country. You can visit the B reactor in Hanford, Washington, which produced plutonium for the nuclear bombs, as if we don't have any bombs anymore. There's a Ronald Reagan National or state historic site in North Dakota where the Grand Forks field was demolished, which pretends to ignore that over in Minot there's still 150 missiles almost surrounding the town. This phenomenon is pretty disturbing, really, because it does teach about the arms race as if it were a thing of the past. We like to keep bringing attention to them in spite of these efforts, and we have found over the years that civil disobedience, ultimately, sometimes anyway, is the only way to bring attention to these missiles, which not just the public want to ignore, but the press and academia. This is the last thing we want to think about, isn't it? Nuclear weapons and war policy. This was 1990 at a silo that has now been demolished, where a group of us, with the help of a friendly nurse who drew the blood, we named this site with some human blood and got prepared for trial. We were charged with trespass, which is a simple charge. They didn't charge us with any damage to the 100-ton concrete lid because a little hose water and a little soap got that off. And I believe that the prosecutor didn't want the jury hearing the word blood mentioned throughout a trial because of its political power. The day before trial, those charges were dropped, and so we declared minor victory there. Second to the right is Jason Lahead, a young man, 18 years old, who joined us from Winnipeg, Manitoba. So the press was very interested in this international protester, and they ran up to him. Mr. Lahead, what's your feeling about the charges having been dropped? And in all seriousness, he said, I hope the Air Force has learned its lesson. He was great. Well, the book also brings a lot of attention, both the first edition and the current edition, because so much has happened in their intervening 27 years, to accidents and mishaps that are quite alarming, quite hair-raising at these missile sites. In this particular expose, Catherine Collins with the Casper Star-Tribune dug up an event that had happened 3 years earlier, where the missile was sending messages back to the Launch Control Center that it was going to launch itself. So the Air Force ran a big, heavy truck out to the site, threw open the gates, and parked the truck on the lid in case it flew open. The truck was going to fall on that missile and just prevent a catastrophe.
Makes sense to me.
After the story ran, Catherine Collins reports, the reporter said she got a lot of calls who said, I don't want to tell you my name, but I'm a missileer, and this happens all the time. So that's another reason you might want to check out Eric Schlosser's new book, Command and Control, which is an illustrated, expansive study of accidents. In the case of his book, the Atlas missile, which preceded these, but he runs through some more recent accidents as well.